You are very welcome to Trasna na Tíre and to a very interesting talk on Father Michael O'Flanagan, the rebel priest, and he really was a rebel priest. Thanks to Liam O'Sullivan, Ben, Neave, Aidan Hassett, who've organised this event, and to all of you who've joined to watch and listen tonight. We're currently experiencing the 2020 lockdown, as you know, but not even a global pandemic is going to stop us remembering our Irish revolutionary history. We have some great talks coming up this week. Tomorrow, Wednesday, 8 p.m, we have a talk on collected memories and medals live from America with Conker O'Doulahan, which promises to be really, really interesting. On Thursday at 8 p.m, I'm interviewing a brilliant historian, Dominic Price, on the 1919 to 24 war in Mayo during both the War of Independence and the Civil War. And the stories of courage and tragedy in that are going to put hairs on the back of your neck. On Friday at 8 p.m, another great historian, Owen Swithin Walsh, will be discussing the War of Independence during 1920, which is bound to be fascinating as it's such an amazing year for the Irish War of Independence. It really, really kicks off. My name is Marcus Howard. For those of you who don't know, I run the Easter Rising Stories YouTube channel, which has 180 full-length documentaries and speeches concerning, all periods of Irish history. Both Trasna na Tíre and Easter Rising Stories were recommended by RTE's History Show, and thank you, Liz Gillis, for that, as historical activities to research during the lockdown. Our speaker tonight is Martin Byrne, and he's a man who's been on a crusade to get Father Michael O'Flanagan remembered correctly. We made a documentary, we collaborated before on this man when I visited Cliffoney with him, and he took me around all the sites. Martin is a member of the Father Michael O'Flanagan Memorial Group. He's an excellent musician as well, brilliant on the uilleann pipes. Father Michael O'Flanagan, the subject, was a fighter against injustice wherever it lay. He wasn't afraid to stand up to anyone. He was a Republican, he was a socialist, he was an inventor, he was a historian, he was a Roman Catholic priest, an Irish language scholar who was friends with many of the 1916 leaders. He was very active in reorganising Sinn Féin. His story is a real roller coaster. So sit back, relax, enjoy a great talk on the rebel priest, Father Michael O'Flanagan. And if you have any comments, please post them below and we can ask them at the end of the talk. Martin, you're very, very welcome to Trasna na Tíre.
Marcus, thanks a million. I'll click this now, yeah, and I will. That's us, I think, is it?
Yeah, perfect.
Lovely. So thanks very much for having me, lads. I'm delighted to be here. So just to introduce this talk and about, I suppose, how I became interested in this subject. This is the furthest thing, if you asked me 5 or 6 years ago, that I could not imagine myself being interested in this subject because I knew very little about history. My background is a tour guide and I would be an archaeologist and I would deal with more mythology than history in general, so Stone Age archaeology. So in 2015, my wife was telling me a story about her father who was born in 1915 and he was known as the rebel baby. And when I heard the story, I was intrigued and we started looking into it. So she started telling me about Father O'Flanagan and I had never heard of this man. And the more I looked into it, the more fascinated I became. As Marcus has just said there, this gentleman was all kinds of different things. And the more you find out about him, the more astonishing the story seems. So started looking into it and done a lot of research in the last 5 years and learned an awful lot about this particular period in history as well. And he's a very interesting individual because he has, I suppose, a unique perspective on that revolutionary period. He was a key figure in Sinn Féin up until, I suppose, 1921, 1922. He reorganised Sinn Féin in 1917 and he was the vice president and later the president of Sinn Féin as well. So I began to find more and more stuff and I was just more and more intrigued. So I'm delighted to be able to be here and tell you a little bit about the story. Now where we are here, I'm in an old RIC barracks. I'll show you a map in a moment of Cliffoney, but I'm actually sitting in the building here which had I think 9 police officers living here back at the time Father O'Flanagan was here. So it's a very, very interesting historic village, Cliffoney is. There's a lot going on in this village. So anyway, if you can see the screen there, there's our 2 protagonists. You have Father Michael O'Flanagan there on the left and you have Bishop Bernard Coyne on the right. And these 2 gentlemen did not get on at all. I'll explain more of that later. But I suppose if Bishop Coyne hadn't been so down on Father O'Flanagan and put him under so much pressure, these things may not have happened that did eventually happen. So one of the keys to the story was I got to meet Father O'Flanagan's niece a couple of years ago And when she was leaving, she handed me this box of papers and she said, would you be interested in these papers? And it turned out that the box was full of letters. It had several telegrams, and it had a lot of speeches, typewritten speeches, and photographs as well. And it was kind of the missing key to a lot of this story. So it was actually a lot of the background letters between Father O'Flanagan and Bishop Coyne, who was trying to silence him or keep him from being involved in this national politics of the era. So we'll talk to you a bit about some of that here as well. So that's our first slide anyway. That's the bishop and the priest who caused him so much trouble. So Father O'Flanagan, born in 1876, just outside Castlereagh. He's born into a Fenian family. His father and his uncles are all involved in the Fenians to a certain extent. It's a very kind of a Republican area. Ned Duffy was from just up the road, who was the organiser of the Fenians in Connacht. So Michael O'Flanagan, he was a child during the land wars, and so they would have seen a lot of evictions and things like that in North Roscommon at the time as well. So he would have grown up in that era. He was the third son, so he was had a vocation, I suppose, as a priest. So he went to Summerhill boarding school in Sligo, and then he went to Maynooth in 1893, and he was ordained a priest in 1900, and he got a job. He was the Irish teacher in Summerhill College. So from 1900 to 1904, he's based in Sligo. He's teaching Irish in Summerhill College. He's giving Irish lessons. He's a member of the Gaelic League. He's giving Irish lessons in Sligo Town Hall. He's a founder member of the Sligo Feis, and he invited Douglas Hyde and Pádraig Pearse down to the Sligo Feis in 1903 and 1904. And Pearse gave a lecture called The Saving of a Nation in 1904 in Sligo Town Hall at Father O'Flanagan's invitation. In 1904, Bishop Clancy, who was the last bishop that Father O'Flanagan got on with, and Horace Plunkett selected Father O'Flanagan to travel to America to raise funds for the church had purchased the old Dillon estate in Loughlin and had brought in some nuns in there, and they set up industry. So they had a cheese making and a dairy industry in there. So Father O'Flanagan was sent off as a missionary, I suppose you could say, to America in 1904. By the way, in 1904 he published his first book as well, which was Irish Phonetics, which was a kind of a primer for people wanting to learn the Irish language. Now, Father O'Flanagan was a native speaker. His mother was a native speaker, and his father was quite a good Irish speaker as well, but he came from a Brack Gaeltacht or Speckled Gaeltacht, which meant it was half Irish and half English there. So he was very, very interested in the Irish language. So he was in the States from 1904 to 1910, and he travelled over and back across the country. He had an industrial exhibition, so he had a team of young ladies with him who were lace makers, and they travelled around various cities and they put on displays of Irish crafts, Irish industry, and he gave historical or quite nationalistic speeches at many of these and lectures as well. So he came back to Ireland again in 1910, and he was elected to the Standing Committee of the Gaelic League in 1910. He also joined Sinn Féin in 1910. I think he had been a member of the Gaelic League since around 1897. I have no evidence for that, but I believe so. That's around the time he started calling himself O'Flanagan instead of Flanagan. So you can see there's a letter there. That's the first letter we have in this collection of papers, and it's dated October the 15th, 1910. And that is Bishop Clancy congratulating Father O'Flanagan on being selected to travel to America as a Gaelic League envoy. And himself and Clinton O'Colum were the two envoys who were sent over at that time. So again, looking in newspaper archives, a huge amount of information in these archives. You can trace the journeys these gentlemen made across the States, trying to raise funds for the Gaelic League, trying to interest people in the Irish language. And you can see he crossed swords with a Yeats and Lady Gregory in 1911. That's a clip from the New York Times in 1911 there. League the Sons, the Irish Players. So they had this problem, the Gaelic League. They weren't so much interested in the Gaelic literary revival because the literary revival was through English mainly, and they were promoting Irish, so they didn't feel that Ireland needed the Irish language through a kind of a fake Irish language almost. So they were not, himself and Pearse and a lot of them were not that impressed with Yeats and Lady Gregory. But that's a clipping anyway, many newspaper clippings of this gentleman. So he's back in Ireland again in 1912, and Bishop Clancy died, I think, in 1912, and he was replaced with Bishop Bernard Coyne. And Bishop Coyne was not a fan of Father O'Flanagan at all. He seems to have been jealous of him, I suppose, essentially. That's what it seems to be. But anyway, Father O'Flanagan, you can see this photograph here. This is the Gaelic League, Ardèche, in July of 1913 outside the Galway Town Hall. And like the O'Donovan Rossa funeral and various different things, this is a who's who of the Irish nationalists or the advanced nationalist movement at the time. So you have Pearses in here, you have Douglas Hyde was the leader. I was just reading the other evening, actually, they had to convince Hyde to go to this meeting because the volunteers, it was becoming much more political, and Hyde wasn't happy with this, so he had to be actually convinced to come to this meeting in Galway, this Ardèche. But anyway, here's Father O'Flanagan over standing here in the crowd. I don't know if you can see it there with the pointer, and he's standing just in front of Count Plunkett, and he's holding a scroll in his hand as well. So anyway, that's he knew a lot of these people at the time. You know, you've got De Valera's in there, you've got Countess Markovitz, you've Eamon Cant, you've the O'Reilly, they're all in there. That is a fabulous photo, by the way. There is a huge copy of it hanging up in Galway Town Hall, and they're still trying to identify some of the names of some of the people on it. When he came back to Ireland, he was moved to Roscommon town, and he was based in Roscommon for about 2 years. And he seems to have had some kind of conflict with the Canon Cummins, who was actually a native of Cliffoney, who was in charge of Roscommon at the time. In 1913, he visited the striking dock workers in Sligo, and this seems to have precipitated his being removed and sent to Cliffoney. Also in 1912, he was sent to Rome, and he gave a series of Advent speeches in Rome for 4 weeks. And in 1914, he was called back to Rome again, and he spent 6 weeks giving the Lenten speeches. So that's when his biography, which we published there a few years ago, which we called From Cliffoney to Crossna, that begins at that time. When he comes back from Rome, he's told by the bishop that he's been removed from Roscommon town and he's being sent to Cliffoney in North Sligo. A little bit like Father Ted in some respects. Troublesome priests were sent off to remote parishes where they hopefully couldn't do any harm. Father O'Flanagan was well able to find trouble wherever he went, as you will see. So this here is Cliffoney village. We have a map here from the Ordnance Survey, so you can see the crossroads at the village here. So this is the main road from Sligo to Donegal. This is the road to Mullaghmore, which is 2 miles from us here. And we are here in the old RIC barracks on the corner. I don't know, can you see that pointer there?
Yeah.
Moving, yeah. That's the barracks on the corner. We have a hotel across the road. We have Cliffoney, what's nowadays Cliffoney Hall. It was a boys' school at the time. And you have St. Malachy's Church, RC Church, here on the corner. St. Malachy's Church was built in 1828 by the landlord, who was Lord Palmerston. Again, somebody who could do with his own lecture, because another fascinating figure, the premier warlord, and invented gunboat diplomacy. So I was researching Lord Palmerston actually when I became interested in Father O'Flanagan. So anyway, that's Cliffoney Church you can see there, and I'm not sure what the date of that photograph is. I'm sure somebody can tell by the cars. And you can just see the corner of the barracks where we are here. And I think you might have an RIC man standing inside the wall there as well. We do know that when Father O'Flanagan moved to Cliffoney, the local people took to him pretty quick, and the RIC used to go in to church and they used to record his speeches, because he made some fairly radical speeches. So 4 or 5 or 6 RIC members would leave the barracks here and trot across the road with their notebooks and sit on the front pew and take notes about what this priest was saying in the church. So his arrival in Cliffoney coincides with the outbreak of World War I. That's a picture from the Welsh collection, and it'll give you an idea of the state of Cliffoney at the time. So it was a very poor and deprived area. It had been taken over by the Congested Districts Board, who were in charge of dividing up the land, or the old Palmerston and Ashley estate, into plots and selling it back to locals. Father O'Flanagan discovered that the Congested Districts Board weren't doing a great job dividing up the land, and he found a lot of poverty when he came to Cliffoney. But that picture is thought to have been taken around 1900, so that's just a picture of the people of Cliffoney, I suppose. A lovely picture, actually. So, in the summer of 1914, he was still in pretty good terms with the church, and he went up to Maynooth and he gave a speech called Fashion in Food. And you can see the headlines up there: Health Gone to the Dogs, striking plea for simple life. And he was talking about food and fashion, basically. That was the whole thing, about why, if you're English, you drink tea, and if you're American, you drink coffee, and the difference between white bread and brown bread. And basically, he was really looking at the Irish diet. You can see him here with his hat. So he was asked, that's a bit like being asked, he was asked to come up and make a speech at that. It was when the priests of the day, they were selected and asked to come and talk at this thing. So it was a bit of an honour, I think, to be asked to speak at the Maynooth Union. And it was attended by Cardinal Logue, who seemingly enjoyed that speech. So he had an interest in industry, he had an interest in agriculture, all of these things, and you'll find out throughout the talk, were consistent interests of his. For the first few months he was in Cliffoney, we had assumed when we started looking into this story that he might have been living in the parochial house about half a mile down the road. But when we got our hands on his memoir, which was in the box of papers, he said that he was not going to live with them, he was not going to move in with the other priests because he'd had a run-in, I suppose, with the priests in Roscommon. A lot of the priests here would have moved into the hotel, which is just across the street from me here. It's a pub and a shop now. Back at that time, it was the Cliffoney Inn. And it was actually run by the brother of Canon Cummins. So he said, I'm not moving in there. That's the brother of the fellow who's after running me out of Roscommon. So he went down, he was quite independent, and he rented a place down in Mullaghmore, about 2 miles from Cliffoney. And he was there for the first few months. And he described swimming in Mullaghmore as well. He was big into swimming. And eventually he moved up to what's called Mrs. Hannon's cottage at the time. And Mrs. Hannon was a sister of the Archbishop of Tuam, Dr. Healy. So she used to rent out this cottage to people. There was a doctor here before Father O'Flanagan, so he moved in and he was living here for about a year. Now this was fascinating to us because when we read the description of this cottage, this is actually the place where my wife grew up. And her father, the rebel baby, who was born in 1915, his parents bought that cottage in 1917, but nobody knew that that was where Father O'Flanagan had lived until we read that biography, or that autobiography in 2016. He described the apple trees, he described the cottage, he described how far it was from the village. And he loved living in Cliffoney. He said he found convivial company in Cliffoney. Now while he was here, he helped to found the Cliffoney Volunteers. Himself and Alex McCabe, who was a student of his in Summerhill, founded the Cliffoney Volunteers in 1914. He was very, very active in things like that. So Mrs. Hannon was the first person to tell him about the situation about the bog. So essentially what was happening in Cliffoney was the bog had not been divided up. There's a huge bog just about a mile from us here in Cliffoney. The Congested Districts Board had taken over the management of the bog and they were using it as kind of leverage. So there's a lot of recruiting going on. The Siddell House is about 10 miles down the road, and the Gore Boots were very active in recruiting people to fight for the British Army. Father O'Flanagan was very active in anti-recruiting for the British Army. He was very, very vocal, and he was very, very anti any young men from Ireland going to fight for a foreign cause. So anyway, when he discovered that the bog was being used as leverage, basically people whose sons were going to fight in the war seemed to be allowed plots of land in the bog, where people who lived here in the village were just not being allowed access. So he tried by writing and by communicating with the Congested Districts Board to sort this problem out, and he got nowhere with them. So interestingly enough, on the 29th of June in 1915, he got the people and he gathered about 200 people outside the church in Cliffoney. They marched up to the bog and they began cutting turf. The police came up and tried to stop them, but 6 RIC men didn't have much hope of stopping 200 people, led by a priest as well. They were all kind of scared too. The priest had a huge power back in those days, so he was very charismatic, Father O'Flanagan. So that was what became known as the Cliffoney Bog Fight, and that went on for the summer. Now the interesting thing about that is the day that these people marched to the bog is the day that O'Donoghue and Rossa died in Staten Island in the States. And as I said, Father O'Flanagan came from a very Fenian background. I have found newspaper clippings, or I have found an article where he talks about having visited O'Donoghue and Rossa in the States. So it's kind of interesting that he led his protest march on the day O'Donoghue and Rossa died. Coincidental, but very interesting. But you can see a newspaper clipping here from 1915 anyway. Father O'Flanagan, from his time in the States, he was quite good at getting newspaper coverage. He was quite a good publicist, and later on he became a propagandist for Sinn Féin as well. So that's, I love that heading, Peasant Armies, Trenches in Bog. So World War I is going on. They're looking for people, Irishmen, to go and fight, and here's a fight going on up in the bog in Clifton. It was sorted out eventually anyway, and they got access to the bog as a result of Father O'Flanagan's intervention. So you have O'Donovan Ross's body is sent back to Ireland. Tom Clarke organises that huge, it was actually like a dress rehearsal for 1916 really. And when you look at it, the O'Donovan Rossa funeral was modelled on Terence McManus's funeral back in the 1860s as well. So Terence McManus was a Fenian who had died in San Francisco, and his body was sent across the States and sent back to Ireland, arrived in Cork, was taken by train up to Dublin, and O'Donovan Rossa was one of the people who accompanied the body on the train, and they were armed at the time as well. So Father Flanagan was asked by O'Donovan Rossa's family. You have Mary Jane O'Donovan Rossa here, O'Donovan Rossa's wife, and you have Eileen, his daughter, and Tom Clarke, who organised the O'Donovan Rossa funeral. So Father Flanagan was selected to speak and to lead the religious aspect of that funeral. And coming from a Fenian background, I always think when you look at this photograph that you can see that he's kind of like a little bit starstruck at the company he's in here. So this is the O'Donovan Rossa funeral, and this is I think this photograph was taken after Father Flanagan made a speech in City Hall. And I think that was a night or two before the funeral actually took place. When O'Donovan Rossa was laying in state in City Hall, Father Flanagan gave a speech to I think 150 select members of the kind of the cream of the nationalists at the time. And there's a lot of mentions of Father Flanagan in the military, the Bureau of Military History statements, and there's quite a few which talk about that speech in City Hall. So that's a postcard that was released by Sinn Féin later on, I suppose, and you can see that they have all signed that postcard as well. And you can see that Father Flanagan is very proud to be in that company. This is the famous photograph of the funeral that takes place, and again they have done a lot of work in identifying the people in the crowd here. Father Flanagan led the prayers at O'Donovan Rossa's funeral. He travelled in the League carriage with the family to the graveyard, and he led the prayers at the funeral, and you can see him standing beside it. His good friend Corey Pierce here. You can see Kathleen Clarke standing here. You have Tom Clarke is here, Darrell Figgis, there's the O'Rahilly up the back. You have John McBride here. I mean, a lot of them have been identified. That's quite a famous photograph. So there was a stamp release there a few years ago. You got the close-up of Pierce and Flanagan, but at the time, a lot of people wouldn't know who Father O'Flanagan was. Everybody knew who Pierce was, but in some respects, every bit is important, I suppose. But so he led the prayers at the O'Donovan Rossa funeral. So the third thing that Father Flanagan did, and this really upset the bishop, was there was T.W. Russell, who was the Minister for Agriculture, or he was an Irish party MP who was sent around to try and encourage people to grow more crops for the war effort. And Father O'Flanagan was not impressed with this. There was a speech made. Russell had a meeting in the courthouse in Sligo. Father O'Flanagan went in and he stood up at the end and he made this speech. And he basically said that it was ridiculous to ask Irish people to grow food for the war effort, that if there was a famine in England as a result of the war, that we would be left to starve as it happened in 1847. And if Irish people had any sense, we would keep the food here and we would feed ourselves. And he had a famous cry came out at that time, it was stick to the oats, keep our oats for ourselves, let England look after ourselves. We have no business being involved in this war. So within 2 days of that, I think, the district inspector of the RIC called around the Bishop of Elphin, Bernard Coyne, and Father Flanagan was transferred to Crossna in North Roscommon. And this is a letter that was in the collection of papers, and it's written in the house he was staying in, October the 12th, 1910. He didn't send it, as it happens. Yes, he says, "My Lord, as your transfer of me to Crossna bears all the appearance of a punishment, I must respectfully request your Lordship to kindly tell me what is my offence." He says he didn't actually send it in the end, but anyway, he decided to just be obedient and to go to Crossna. The local people in Cliffoney who had become very fond of Father Flanagan, he'd been here for 15 months at that stage, so they thought of a number of different things they might do. They were going to hide his bicycle so he couldn't cycle away. They were making sure that nobody would give him a lift across Crossna, which is about 40 miles south of here. In the end, they took direct action. You could say he had taught them pretty well, because what they did was they went in to the door of the church here and they seized the key of the sacristy. They nailed the main door of the church shut, and then they locked the church. So no successor priest was allowed to go into Cliffoney Church after Father Flanagan was removed. And this became known as the Tiffany Rebellion. And this was very, very embarrassing for the church. And that's probably one of the reasons why not many people have heard of this story. The Tiffany Rebellion My father-in-law, John Rattigan, was known as the rebel baby because he was born on the 17th of October in 1915, and that was the morning the church was locked. There was another baby born during the rebellion as well, Jack Waters, and neither of those two gentlemen were baptized until the rebellion was over. So the local people knelt down outside the door of the church each evening, and they said the rosary, praying for the return of Father O'Flanagan to Cliffoney. And that could be the first example of a protest rosary as well, which you find a lot of that going on outside prisons and things later on over the next few years. But the standoff lasted for 10 weeks, and the bishop sent Father O'Flanagan up a couple of times to try and sort it out. The villagers had a public meeting in the middle of the village, and I think one person decided, there was the whole village was united. I think there was one person dissenting saying we should open the church. The whole, I don't know how many people were here at the time, but no, they weren't going to open the church. The people of Cliffoney marched into Sligo as well to confront the bishop about this, and seemingly when the bishop heard they were coming, he got into a chauffeur-driven car and took off for Dublin. He wasn't going to confront this angry group of villagers. They also sent a petition to the Pope as well, which Father O'Flanagan had intercepted. So in the end, he asked them to open the church on Christmas Eve as a Christmas present for himself. So Father O'Flanagan more or less put the rebellion to rest. So I think that's one of the most significant aspects of this story, is that a whole village united and stood up to the Catholic Church in the autumn of 1915. And I think that is just an amazing story. That's really what got me so interested in this story. The bishop was furious. He reckoned that Father O'Flanagan had put the local people up to this, and he blamed him for the whole thing. Now, when he moved down to Crossna, he carried on pretty much as normal. So within a short space of time, you can see there, that's a poster which comes from Father O'Flanagan's RAC report, and he was asked to go up to St. Mary's Hall in Belfast, and he gave a speech for the Manchester martyrs, who were his favourite of all of the Irish martyrs. So this box of papers had quite a few of his speeches, and you can see here on the left, this is one of his typewritten speeches. This is one of the things I've done during the lockdown, is I typed out that speech and put it onto a website. So if anybody wants to read it, the whole thing is there. It's pretty fascinating. He mentions that he has recently been at a Gaelic League lecture where Pádraig Pearse was speaking about the four evangelists of Irish nationalism. And Father O'Flanagan disagreed with his analysis, and he reckoned that the Manchester martyrs were very, very important, and he explains that in the speech why. But I'll let you read that for yourself anyway. It's a fascinating speech. So that was the 25th of November, 1915. Now at this stage, Father O'Flanagan had come to the attention of the RAC in a fairly serious manner, and they kept quite a large file on him. And May Moran from Crossna, who is another researcher, and she has given me access to a lot of her research, and she has photocopied his RAC reports, which runs to about 350 pages, and that's in Kew Gardens. So that poster there, you can see the paper clip, that's actually clipped into his RAC file. He's asked to go to Cork. As a result of the Cliffoney carry-on and all that, he became very popular as a rebel priest, and he was asked to go to a lot of speeches. So on I think it was the 12th of January 1916, he was asked to go to Cork, and he went and he made a speech in Cork City Hall. There was 150 volunteers present at that speech. 30 of the volunteers were armed, and they were led by Terence McSweeney, and the event was chaired by Thomas McCurtain. So again, two more gentlemen that Father O'Flanagan knew well from the Gaelic League and from the volunteer side of things as well. This was an enormous, a huge attendance at this speech, and everything was recorded by the RAC. It was printed in the papers, seditious speech made by a priest. The bishop had wind of it within 2 days, and he sends a letter to Father O'Flanagan forbidding him to speak outside the parish of Crossna without permission in writing from the bishop. So he's supposed to stick to his priestly duties and stay out of all this madness that's going on at the time. But this is why there's quite a lot of these letters between Father O'Flanagan and the bishop, and they give such an interesting background to the whole story, because you don't generally see what goes on behind the closed door of the church and how priests are disciplined. And for me, I find it fascinating to see that bishops could discipline priests when it suited them, and you can see in much later times with all the abuse and all this that has gone on, bishops often didn't bother disciplining priests, but we can see from Father O'Flanagan's case they were well able to discipline priests if they wanted to. So anyway, that's a letter of discipline from Bishop Point to Father O'Flanagan, dated the 14th of January 1916. So Father Flanagan has a good friend here, Dr. John Hagan, who is he's the rector in the Irish College in Rome, and this is a handwritten letter to Dr. Hagan, and he's telling him about the speech they had in Cork and describing it to him, and that's the 18th of January in 1916. And he also asks it was Dr. Hagan who he asked him to intercept that petition that was sent by the people of Cliffoney to the Pope as well. So he's important later on as well. De Valera went over in the late 1920s, or the mid 1920s, when he was struggling with the issue of the oath, and it was Dr. Hagan who kind of gave him the formula that would enable him to enter the Dáil, whatever method he used. So De Valera actually used to disguise himself as a priest. He went to Rome, I think, a few times disguised as a priest to consult with Dr. Hagan. Here's another interesting letter that was in that box of papers. It's the 20th of January 1916, and it's addressed to my good friend Sean. I found out it's addressed to Sean McEntee, who was the head of the volunteers, or he was inviting Father Flanagan to go up and give a speech, I think, in Dundalk. And Father Flanagan says in his memoir he got tired of having to explain to people that he couldn't leave Crossna or he couldn't make speeches. And he says at the end of this letter that it's in the interests of the bishop to stay in good terms with the British government and the castle, because they're receiving huge grants for convents, orphanages, nursing homes and all this. Basically the bottom line is money, so the bishops have to toe the line. So if the RIC tell the bishops to discipline this priest or that priest, they have to do it because it has to keep the cash flow. That's a pretty interesting letter in itself. And if anybody is interested in this stuff, we do have a Facebook page and we have a website as well, and I'm adding as much of this stuff to it as I can, and it's a huge volume of information. So 1916 happens. Father Flanagan was quite militant. When he moved to Crossna, he became good friends with Paddy Moran, and he actually brought down a case of Hoth rifles, I think, to Crossna on the train for the Crossna volunteers. And this is pretty interesting as well, because he was very proud of his reputation, and in more modern times, I think it's Dermot Ferreter has said that Father O'Flanagan, there's a bit of confusion about this, but Leslie Price, who later married Tom Barry, she talked in her military witness statement about a priest called Father Flanagan who refused, who said that the people in the GPO in 1916 deserved to die, let them die. Dermot Ferreter assumed that that was Father O'Flanagan, the Vice President of Sinn Féin. Wasn't. We know now from Father Flanagan's memoir, he was actually in Crossna at the time waiting. He knew something was going to happen. He was there with the Crossna volunteers, and nothing did happen. And it turns out it was Father John Flanagan from the Pro Cathedral. So that calumny, as you might say, has actually spread through several history books. It appeared in an article of Fintan O'Toole's in 1918 saying that Father O'Flanagan was a bit of a hypocrite because he had no time for the men of 1916 in 1916, and then here we are in 1917, he's all over them. It turns out that they got that one completely backwards. That was not the same Father O'Flanagan at all. Anyway, there is an RIC report, and the RIC reports are absolutely fascinating. And that one is the 13th of the 6th, 1916. And I beg to submit attached a copy of a letter from the Roman Catholic bishop dated from St. Mary's in Sligo and signed Bernard Coyne. Also a copy of a letter from Father Michael O'Flanagan, CC, Crossna, to John F. McEntee with reference there too. So they had found this letter that Father Flanagan had sent to Sean McEntee, and that was used, I suppose, it was added to the file of evidence. And that's just to sum up that picture there, the whole notion of what happened in 1916. You can see John Bull here, the RIC officer, arresting this dirty Fenian with his Irish Republic flag and putting him into the paddy wagon. So it just kind of gives you a sense of, you know, there's many different, I suppose, opinions about how this was all perceived at the time, but that's from a clipping from a newspaper, I think, as well. So Father O'Flanagan, as I said, he had formed a company of the volunteers in Cliffoney with the help of Alex McCabe, and Alex McCabe went on to become a TD later on. And this is a paper from the National Library, and it shows the people who were arrested in Sligo, the prisoners deported from County Sligo after 1916, and there's 17 names on that list, and 15 of them are from Cliffoney, and the other 2 are from South Sligo. Alec McCabe, who was from Kesh, and a gentleman Carol Crowley as well. So again, you can see the influence that Father O'Flanagan had at that time, that basically these were the serious rebels, I suppose, that were here. So that's a list of the Prisoner Defendants Fund, I think that comes from. Very interesting document. This is another letter that was in the collection of papers. So this is December the 9th, 1916, and this is a little bit like Father Ted again. It's like, where's the money resting in the account? And this is the bishop is writing to Father O'Flanagan looking to know where's the money from the Cliffoney account. And he explains quite clearly where the money was, and in no uncertain terms. But the interesting thing in this letter is he was holding the money for the Cliffoney volunteers in the joint church account, and then the money was taken out to buy equipment, whatever type of equipment the volunteers might have needed. So that one is a very, very interesting letter. But he's not shy of telling them basically to cop on that they already have the book and they have access to the account. What are they coming looking to him for? It basically is what he's saying. So he's grounded anyway. He's not supposed to leave the Crossna. So for the summer, as he says himself, after the Easter Rising, for the next 9 months, the country was very uncertain. Nobody knew what was going to happen. You had the executions happened. There was a kind of sense of the doldrums there. Nobody really knew which way things were going to go. The country was shocked by the executions. So he's grounded in Crossna. He's not allowed to leave. And as luck would have it, an old Fenian, J.J. O'Kelly, dies in December of 1916. Now, O'Kelly is a fascinating individual. I don't know if anybody's familiar with him, but I think he fought in Little Bighorn. He was in Mexico, I think, fighting for the French. He was a prisoner in Cuba. He was in France with James Stephens. He travelled the world, but as they say, he settled down then and he became an MP. He was a Fenian who became a politician, and the one place he never visited was his constituency in North Roscommon. I think he was an MP for 30 years. I never once visited his constituency. He died anyway at the end of December, and Father O'Flanagan decided it was time to do something and decided to contest the North Roscommon election. So first of all, they approached Michael Davitt, the son of the Landleaguer. Michael Davitt's mother told him, don't get involved. So then they decided on Count Plunkett. Count Plunkett at the time was under house arrest in Oxford. So Father O'Flanagan, I think Gaelic, and there was a few of them. There was only a few people involved at the very start of this, but they wrote a letter to Count Plunkett and asked him would he consider standing as an independent candidate in the North Roscommon by-election. Count Plunkett said yes, and he came back to Ireland, I think without permission, and we have what we call the election of the Snows, which took place, I think, on the 3rd of February of 1917. Count Plunkett was a complete outsider. There were two gentlemen, Tully and Devine, who were sure that Devine was sure he was going to get the job for the Irish party. This was kind of a shot over the bows, really, because they were not expecting this. Count Plunkett ended up winning by a landslide. The main organiser and the main speaker for the election of the Snows was Father O'Flanagan. Also Lawrence Ginnell joined him as well, who was a kind of a rebel Irish party MP. So Count Plunkett won by a landslide. And when he was making his acceptance speech, he said that he was not going to go to the English Parliament, that he was going to stay in Ireland and serve the Irish people from home. And when he won, a rank outsider, nobody was expecting it. It was a complete shock to the Irish party that somebody out of the blue would have taken this seat. So Count Plunkett was feted, I suppose, afterwards. He was made a freeman of Kilkenny. He was given the freedom of Sligo on St. Patrick's Day in 1917. And Father O'Flanagan had been heavily involved in this, and I suppose he was travelling around a bit with Count Plunkett. And again, he gets censured by the bishop. I think Father O'Flanagan may have made a speech when Count Plunkett got the freedom of Sligo. So we have another letter here, 18th of March, 1917. And this is the bishop. He says, I find it my painful duty now, in your own best interests, as well as for the grave reasons mentioned above, to forbid you, a lot of Latin there, to be present at or attend any public meeting or demonstration outside the parish of Coothall without my permission. So not only is he not allowed to leave, now he's not allowed to attend or speak at any meeting. So the bishop is really trying to rein him in and hobbled him as a result of his attendance or his activities with the election of the Snows. So you have 4 more 3 more by-elections. You can see these are the badges that were made for those. Vote for Count Plunkett, the man for Ireland, is the first one. You have the Longford by-election then, and they voted for Joe McGuinness this time. Father Flanagan was not allowed to attend or become involved in that election, and that one was almost won by the Irish Party. I think McGuinness won by something like 35 votes after a recount. De Valera didn't want the soldiers to become involved in politics, and he was actually against McGuinness being ran as a candidate, but Thomas Ashe was for it. De Valera was up next, and he wins the East Clare by-election, and then you have the fourth one is August 1917. You have Liam Cosgrove was elected. Now, they also lost 4 by-elections at this time as well. You only really hear about the elections that were won, and that's a picture, by the way, from the National Library, and you can see these 2 gentlemen. I'm not sure where they are or which badges they have, but they're wearing their badges. I suppose you could say independence badges at this time, because these were not Sinn Féin elections. You'll be told nowadays that these were the first Sinn Féin elections, but the Sinn Féin hadn't coalesced at that time yet into what it would later become. So that's the 4 by-elections, and they really missed Father Flanagan's influence, and he was actually cracking up. According to the police reports, he was going mad that he wasn't allowed to attend the McGuinness elections down in Longford, or to canvass for them. There's a few mentions of it in his police reports that he was considering leaving the priesthood at the time, which is probably not true, because he was quite devoted to his religious calling. So Count Plunkett called a convention in April of 1917 after winning the Plunkett Convention, and it was to gather all of the bodies who were interested in advanced nationalism at the time in the Mansion House. And there was a split straight away. Sean Milroy, I think, put forward a motion that they would carry on with Sinn Féin's party equipment, like newspaper offices and things like that, whereas Count Plunkett was not a fan of Arthur Griffith. A lot of people actually were not a fan of Arthur Griffith at the time, and he wasn't Republican enough. So there was a split more or less at that time, and Father Flanagan actually had to mediate between Count Plunkett and Arthur Griffith at that Mansion House conference. And I have found in the book afterwards as well, Michael Collins was actually outraged as well, and he came in and he tore the head off Arthur Griffith for the Constitution, or what they were talking about not being Republican enough. But as a result of that anyway, you had what became known as the Mansion House Committee, and that was a kind of a group of people who were interested in advanced nationalism at the time. So it was kind of like a rainbow umbrella group, you could say. And then when the prisoners were released in 1917, the prisoners were co-opted onto that as well. Now, I'll mention it later on, but in 1934, Father Flanagan gave a speech called The Strength of Sinn Féin, and he goes back and he looks at all of these early meetings, and one of the interesting things he says is the split was there from the start. You had Count Plunkett and you had Griffith. They had to be kind of drawn together and kind of bandaged in together, so that was the first split, and he goes on and he lists the various different splits that were in Sinn Féin. Anyway, the Mansion House Committee met over the summer, and what they did was basically they organised the Sinn Féin Ardèche for October 1917. So Father Flanagan was still, despite the ban of the bishop, he was still going giving lectures. So this one is for the Gaelic League, Cumberna Gaelga, and he was giving a lecture up in Omagh entitled Orange and Green. And he was very interested in exploring what way things were going to fall out with the situation up in the north, and how were we going to have a united Ireland with the resistance that there was up in the north. So he was still defying the bishop, and he was still making these speeches. And again, this was widely covered in the newspapers, and every word he said was reported by the RAC or recorded by the RAC. So he is trying to make amends with the bishop here, and basically he's sent on a retreat to Milltown Park up in Dublin. And this letter is dated 29th of September 1917. So he's trying to get back, I suppose, into the bishop's good books and get his faculties restored as well. I always find his letters very interesting when you read them, because you can see how he's kind of scratching out bits of sentences. I'd say he would have loved a word processor where you can delete things and kind of that. You find reading through his papers are very, very interesting, how he's writing and he's editing as he goes along as well. So that's him anyway. He goes and he makes his retreat, and the bishop grants him, you can see this letter here on the left, he restores his faculties to him again and basically tells him to cop on. On the right here we have another police report dated the 29th of October 1917, and the police is saying, "I beg to report that Father O'Flanagan has returned to Crossna." They were wondering where he was. They thought he might be staying with Count Plunkett up in Dublin because he had spent a lot of time out of the parish of Crossna. And it turns out he was chairing a lot of those Mansion House committee meetings. And what they were doing was they were working towards the Sinn Féin Ardèche of 1917. So that police report is dated the 29th of October 1917. And this is what he was up to up in Dublin. They were organising the Sinn Féin Ardèche, which took place at the end of October. And the prisoners had come back over that summer and they had joined the Mansion House Committee as well. And Father Flanagan did say in his 1934 speech that was probably, in hindsight, quite a big mistake that they made. But anyway, they had the election. Arthur Griffith stepped down and allowed, De Valera was voted president of Sinn Féin. They decided to stick with Sinn Féin, and this is where you really, anything before this is not really Sinn Féin. It's a kind of a homogenous group. From here on in, you're talking about Sinn Féin. So Arthur Griffith and Father O'Flanagan were the two vice presidents. You have the two treasurers, Cosgrove and Ginnell. You have the two secretaries, Ostenstack and Darrell Figgis. And as I said, that speech is very interesting because when Father Flanagan analyses this in 1934, he goes through this list and he says, Republican, Free State. They divided almost down the line. There's 24 people on that list and you have 12 go with the Free State, 12 with the Republican movement. So the split was there from the start. Very, very interesting. But anyway, he's elected vice president of Sinn Féin at that time. You have the East Cavan by-election comes up next. So Father Flanagan is in Crossna. He's being fairly well behaved. You have the German plot, and the standing committee of Sinn Féin are arrested. This is in the spring. This is in April of 1918. And Arthur Griffith is up for election against John Dillon, and Father Flanagan is begged to come out and canvass for Sinn Féin. This is a vital by-election, and again Griffith wins by quite a large majority, but as a result of this, Father Flanagan was suspended by the church again. That's a letter from the Bishop of Kilmore warning Father Flanagan to stay out of that region because he doesn't want him coming in or interfering. At the same time, he has organised a drama group in Crossna, and you can see here they're putting on a play up in Dublin, the Gaelic Saxon and Ireland First, and that is to raise money for the Prisoners Dependent Fund. While he's canvassing for Arthur Griffith, he makes this famous speech which is called Father O'Flanagan's Suppressed Speech, and Sinn Féin had it printed afterwards. And as a result of this speech, Father O'Flanagan was suspended again by the Bishop. And you can see this letter here from 5th of June. So he's warning Father Flanagan that he's withdrawing all his facilities, including the permission to say Mass from Father O'Flanagan. The people of Crossna, when they find out, they do what the people of Cliffoney did. They lock the church. But this standoff lasts for about 3 weeks. And Father O'Flanagan again asked them to please just open the church and stay out, let the church sort it out for themselves. On midsummer of 1918, he's given the freedom of Sligo because of his contribution towards the nationalist movement. And that is him standing on a chair on the steps of Sligo Town Hall. I've since discovered that photograph's actually from 1919. I only discovered that in a newspaper clipping a few weeks ago. But there was no mention anyway of him being suspended. He's the vice president of Sinn Féin at that meeting there, receiving the freedom of Sligo. So there's a lot of moves behind the scenes to try and sort out this issue. Bishop Healy had died and he's replaced by Bishop Gilmartin, and he acts an intermediary between Father O'Flanagan and Bishop Coyne, and there's a lot of effort to try and sort this thing out, and it goes on for quite a while. The top letter there, 26th of June 1918 and the 28th of June, and the Bishop is really, really angry in some of these letters. This is a letter on Sinn Féin notepaper from the 27th of September 1918, and Father Flanagan is trying to trace the source of a rumour that says that he's going to leave the priesthood, and he's not a bit happy about this, so he's very precious of his reputation. But it's fascinating, there's a watermark in it as well, that he was printing it on Sinn Féin notepaper. He had the support of a lot of other priests. These are some of the priests who are in Milltown Park, and they're just writing a note to him to tell him that they're supporting him and trying to trace the rumour as well. But they never get to the bottom of it as far as I know. So here you have the 1918 election, or sorry, the 1918 Sinn Féin convention, which is presided over by Father Flanagan because basically everybody else is in prison. You have the Sinn Féin election manifesto. This is where they're preparing for the 1918 election. And the Sinn Féin election manifesto was written by Michael Collins, Harry Boland, and Father O'Flanagan. The election is a landslide, and as you know, it took place during an influenza pandemic. Father O'Flanagan travelled the length and breadth of the country. He had volunteers who were driving him. I think there was something like 3 funerals passed by him in Ballymote while he was making a speech during that election campaign. But as we all know, they won by a landslide and they decimated the Irish party. And Father O'Flanagan was asked to speak in the Dáil in 1919 by Cathal Brugha. He was the first person to speak in the Dáil as a recognition of all the work he had put into organising this event. So he was the curate of the Dáil as well, or the chaplain of the Dáil. This postcard was in the box of papers. That's a 1966 postcard from the centenary, the half centenary of 1916. And this is the 10th of April 1918, and De Valera has been sprung from prison. You can see them all sitting here, and they have their chaplain standing over here on the right. That's a picture I found in the National Library, and that's from midsummer of 1918, and Count Plunkett is chairing that meeting of the Dáil because De Valera has gone to the States at that stage to collect money. You can see Father O'Flanagan here attending the Dáil meeting at that time. Quite a nice drawing. I'm going to just move through it a little bit faster here because I have a bit to go, not too much. That's a poster I found there recently enough online. There was a film made of the leadership and of Sinn Féin back in 1919, and it never saw the light of day. It was seized by the RAC, but there were posters for it which were released. So you can see the leaders at the time: Countess Markovitz, Lawrence Ginnell, Griffith, Plunkett, and Father O'Flanagan, and De Valera up the top. It'd be fantastic to see that film, but I do believe it was destroyed. So they're still trying to make peace between Father O'Flanagan and the bishop here. So this is a copy of a note. I regret any violations of ecclesiastical law or precept of which I may have been objectively guilty, and I recognise and accept the obligation in future of obeying all ecclesiastical laws and precepts duly notified to me. They're still trying to make friends with, or trying to sort out this mess, the Bishop of Tuam, and that's another attempt. I think there's 7 drafts of this letter because Father Flanagan just can't believe that the bishop is being so stubborn, I suppose, about all of this. And that picture is from around that same time as well. That, I think, is in May of 1919, and it took quite a while to figure out who these gentlemen at the front were, but you can see the picture here. You have Father Flanagan, Arthur Griffith, you have Lawrence O'Neill. Still not sure who this gentleman over here is. He's listed as Dr. Cosgrove of Sinn Féin, but I don't think it's Liam Cosgrove. Not sure who he is. You have Count Plunkett and you have De Valera. And the gentlemen here are Edward Dunn, Frank Walsh, and Michael Ryan. And these were 3 American diplomats who had been sent over to the Paris Peace Conference to push Ireland's case for independence. And they called in to visit the leadership of Sinn Féin on their way back. In the witness statements it says Michael Collins was there that day as well, but there was a raid on the Mansion House on that day, and Collins had to go and hide or disappear, but he was seemingly in his volunteer uniform. He was there somewhere that day. That's quite an amazing photograph. De Valera was looking for funds from the States, and he was asking these 3 gentlemen how would he get money from the States, and they said, you'll have to come over and raise it yourself. We can't do it. It would be illegal for us to do it, so you come and do it. So De Valera headed off on his 18-month tour of the States. I love that picture of him there. That's how he got his affection of being called the chief, because he was initiated into a tribe in Madison in Wisconsin during his time in America. That's a postcard of the Paris Peace Conference, which comes from the UCD archives. And you can see that they were hoping basically that Ireland would be invited to attend the Paris Peace Conference. And again, you can see this gentleman in his volunteer uniform being invited to the head of the table by Uncle Sam. And you can see John Bull is sitting here as well, and he's not a bit pleased to see this gentleman arriving in. That kind of says it all. Nobody got a look in anyway, apart from the big powers at that time. They're still trying to sort out this mess with the bishop, and here's another police report as well, and this one is about Father Flanagan's attending a feis in Kilmallock. So as you can see, a lot of police notes and police reports about Father O'Flanagan. Another letter from the bishop here, and they're still trying to sort it out, and they're still getting nowhere. So he's still fighting with the bishop on the 3rd of July 1919. Eventually he sent on a retreat again, and he sent back to Roscommon, and Canon Cummins is still the person who removed him from Roscommon in 1914 and sent him to Cliffoney. Father Flanagan has gone and done the retreat. He's done what the bishop asked him to do, but Canon Cummins doesn't want him back, and he says there's no place for him there. So eventually he is sent back to Roscommon, and you can see more editing going on here as well. Now, while he's in Roscommon, he's close enough to his family home, and that is a picture of him with his parents. This is Edmund Flanagan, his father, and when he was young he was known as Michael Edmund, and his mother is Mary Crawley, and she was an Irish speaker, Mary Crawley from Topanus side, Castlereagh. And this picture, again, this family portrait, was in the box of papers that was handed to us that time. And that's a letter that he's writing to his parents as well. So again, just very interesting, the more human side of him. He's talking about where they came from, he's talking about parish priests, he's talking about the meaning of place names in the area. Now, we're coming here to what happened here in Cliffoney. Father Flanagan's flats and his rooms were raided in North Roscommon, and a lot of his papers were seized. They were raided by 2 auxiliaries and 2 RIC officers. Around the same time, on the 25th of October, you have the Cliffoney ambush. So policemen who were here, 9 policemen in this building where I am now, were on a patrol, and about 2.5 miles down the road they were ambushed by the local IRA. 2 of them were shot dead at the time, and 2 of them died of their wounds afterwards. And you can see here, that's the day Terence McSweeney died. That's a newspaper clipping about Terence McSweeney's funeral. That's the reception in Cork. And you also see Kevin Barry over here on the side as well. This very interesting little picture I found in the National Library, and that's Muriel McSweeney, and it's labelled Father O'Flanagan, but it's actually Daniel Mannix, who was stranded in England at the time. The British government would not allow him to come to Ireland, so it was identified by Torrid O'Brien actually, and that's them visiting Terence McSweeney in Brixton Prison. It was not Father O'Flanagan. Father O'Flanagan was used by De Valera as a courier to travel over and back with letters to Bishop Mannix. There you have a selection of, you have a Dublin police officer here, you have 2, I don't know where the black and tans are auxiliaries, but they're all heavily armed, and you have a Tommy. So we have the reprisals that take place for the Moneygold ambush here, and on the 25th of October 1920, when the policemen were shot, within a few days several lorry loads of auxiliaries came and they burned the Cliffoney village. They burned the village of Cliffoney. The hall across the road was known as the Father Flanagan Sinn Féin Hall, and it's where the volunteers in the area drilled. The hall was burnt to the ground, as well as 7 cottages in the village as well, and you can see the graffiti up there, vacated home of a murder gang. So that's the Father Flanagan Hall burnt to the ground. And that's Bernie Conway's house in Cliffoney as well, burnt. These were all thatched houses, and they used to come and shake petrol on the thatches. Even if they wouldn't set them on fire, they would leave them in a state where the locals would be afraid to go in and light a fire in case they burnt their own house. So that's Bernie Conway's house. And Bernie Conway was a good friend of Father O'Flanagan's. His brother Andrew Conway was one of the leaders of the local company of volunteers of the IRA. But Bernie Conway was an RIC officer who resigned from the RIC. So you can see, even resigning from the RIC, you still weren't safe. So his house was burnt as well, I suppose, as a traitor. So essentially, the reason we have all these papers from Father Flanagan is that he placed them in hiding on the 1st of November in 1920. That's the day that Kevin Barry was executed. He hid his papers in the Loch Lynn convent, and you can see this handwritten note on the papers. These papers were placed here on November the 1st, 1920 by Father Michael O'Flanagan and Sister Gerard Carty and Michael McDermott, who was in charge of the electric engine in the laundry, in order to save them from raids of Lloyd George's auxiliaries and so-called police, M. O'Flanagan. And that's written on the back of one of his bishop's letters, or letters from the bishop. So he starts looking at what's going on in the country. This is a section of an essay that he was writing at the time about the situation. Father Griffin had been killed at that time. He refers to Father Griffin's murder here. He's talking about the tit-for-tat killings that are going on and the reprisals. Lloyd George obviously had sent the black and tans and the auxiliaries here, and the country was, you know, on fire at the time. And that's another clipping from a newspaper. That's Lloyd George's peace offering to Ireland and its martial law. But Father Flanagan takes it on himself to start writing telegrams to Lloyd George, and that happens on the 5th of December 1920. And he's basically calling Lloyd George out because Lloyd George is making sounds about peace, and we want peace, we all want peace. So Father Flanagan sends him a telegram saying, well, what are you talking about? Like, if you want peace, we all want peace. And this really raised alarm bells with the rest of Sinn Féin, because Father Flanagan was the only member still on the loose, apart from, I suppose, Michael Collins. Harry Boland was gone to America. Michael Collins was outraged because he was making his own secret peace moves at the time, and Father Flanagan really pulled the rug out from under his feet, possibly quite intentionally, because the two of them didn't really seem to like each other. Michael Collins referred to Father Flanagan as Father Mick, and he reckoned that, you know, Father Mick had to be in charge, and he had a few choice comments to say about him. This is a draft of another telegram to Lloyd George, and there's a huge amount of these again in the newspaper archives. It got a huge amount of coverage in the press, and Sinn Féin put notice in the paper to say it's nothing to do with us. He's speaking for himself. So this is another telegram again that was in that collection of papers. This is a telegram from Lloyd George to Father O'Flanagan. It was a 7-page telegram, and I'm sure it's worth a pretty penny now, dated the 11th of December 1920. And he's saying that we all want peace, of course, and you can see it's signed here by Lloyd George. That's another draft of a telegram to Lloyd George as well, in a handwritten note. So anyway, that doesn't end well for Father O'Flanagan, really. He kind of is in bad favour with a lot of the members of Sinn Féin after that, but not De Valera. De Valera actually uses him as an envoy and sends him to Downing Street, and he has several meetings with Lloyd George and also with Edward Carson on exploratory peace moves. And it's pretty interesting because De Valera and O'Flanagan knew exactly what was on offer from Downing Street, and there was no republic coming. So anyway, he was sent off. They had an Ardèche in October of 1921, and Father Flanagan was sent off to be a Republican envoy. He was sent to America initially, about 6 weeks before the treaty was signed, and then he was sent to Australia in 1923, himself in Gaelic. And they managed to, there was a lot of controversy in the papers because the Civil War happened. You had the Free State then. So you have Father Flanagan a bit like a loose cannon over in the States, and lots of newspaper articles. And the same thing happened in Australia. So they were arrested for sedition in Australia, and they did 8 weeks in prison, and again a huge amount of coverage in the newspapers. Eventually they were kicked out of Australia. Now, in later life, there's coming towards the end here now, there were many other aspects to this individual. So he was an inventor, and he had 4 patents to his name, and he'd been working on these swimming goggles for quite a while. But he patented them in 1927, and he was selling them from his house in Bray in Dublin. And so he actually invented the modern swimming goggles, would you believe. He also invented cavity insulation and a kind of a gyroscopic bed for travelling on ocean liners. He also worked on the Ordnance Survey letters, and this is a huge collection of information that was gathered. In 1837, it was the Ordnance Survey collected huge amounts of information in every county in Ireland. These were all handwritten notes, and they were kept in the Phoenix Park, and a lot of the Gaelic Leaguers were worried that they might be destroyed. So Father Flanagan was given money in 1925 for the 25th anniversary of his ordination. He was given $7,000 in America. He spent that money on hiring typists. They had a room in the National Library, and they typed up the Ordnance Survey letters, which was a monumental task. It took about 5 years. And for many years, they were placed in every library and institution, and in institutions in the States as well. And we as archaeologists are still using them. They were being redone by Michael Herity, who died a few years ago. So I think 8 counties were still not republished. So 8 counties are still using Father Flanagan's versions of the Ordnance Survey letters. And that's John O'Donovan and Eugene O'Curry, who were involved in the Ordnance Survey. Interestingly enough, John O'Donovan's sons were sworn into the Fenian movement by O'Donovan Rossa. So there's all these kind of funny little connections in all of this. This is 1934. He's elected, he's the vice president of Sinn Féin for a number of years, and he's elected president in 1934. And that's that speech he makes, The Strength of Sinn Féin, which is an absolutely fascinating read. He's kicked out of Sinn Féin in 1936 because he participates in a radio broadcast, and he's telling about his part that he played in the nationalist movement in that time period. And as he said himself, it would take more than standing committee of Sinn Féin from stopping me talking to the Irish people about the role I had in this. So he's kicked out of Sinn Féin. He doesn't seem to mind too much. The next thing that happens to him is in 1937, he becomes involved in the Spanish Civil War. He comes out of his office because he's actually working on county histories at that time. And he makes 2 trips to Spain. And he's virtually the only Catholic in Ireland who is actually against Franco. Everybody else is collecting money for bullets and for different things. He made several trips to America and collected money and sent food, blankets, all of this kind of stuff. And he again got a lot of flack for his stance in the Spanish Civil War. He died in 1942 of stomach cancer, just a week short of his 66th birthday. And here on the right you have his last letter, which was sent to Bernie Conway in Cliffoney, 2nd of August 1942. Goodbye to you, and dear Cliffoney, I am dying with a very special love of the people in my inmost heart. I will be waiting in heaven to greet the Cliffoney people, especially those who prayed for me in front of the church door, Father Michael O'Flanagan. But fascinating that his kind of revolutionary journey starts in Cliffoney, and he's still thinking of the people of Cliffoney when he dies. That's his mass card from 1942. Those are some photographs of his funeral that were again in the collection of papers, and these are some members of his family here. He had a state funeral which was attended by De Valera, and I think there was something like 21,000 people filed by his coffin when it was on display in Dublin. So, National Graves Association last year had an event for Father O'Flanagan, and we were thrilled to be up at it, and I got to play my pipes up there. I was actually sitting on Maud Gonne's grave playing. Father O'Flanagan is buried between Osnastack and Maud Gonne. So his grave wasn't marked until 1992 on the 50th anniversary of his death, and the National Graves put a plaque up at that stage. They contacted us last year and they put up a Celtic cross, and Father O'Flanagan has since been included on the tours in Glasnevin as well as a result of all of this. So Tommy McCartney made a fantastic speech up there last year. We played some music and we were very, very happy to have been involved in it. I know there was another event going on from the Citizen Army the same day, but we're thrilled to have been there and to have participated in that event. And that speech that Tommy McCartney made is up on Father O'Flanagan's website as well. And that's my last slide. That's the cover of the book that has been written about him by Dennis Carroll, They Have Fooled You Again, which refers to the Spanish Civil War. And this is the book we published ourselves here in Cliffoney to Crossna. So, sorry, now I had to rush a bit there at the end. I just realised I was going on a bit.
No, not at all. Geez, you were great. So you were fascinating fascinating presentation, I should say. It was nearly like a documentary watching it. Do you want to just turn off the sharing screen there? I'll just go through some of the questions.
Sure.
Martin, we got loads of questions here and loads of comments too. So Conker O'Doulahan says the photos were brilliant, and if anyone appreciates good photos, it's Conker O'Doulahan. I have one or two questions. How is a revolutionary act covered nationally in the press regarding the parish locking up a church in defiance of the bishop? You know, like how would the national press react?
There were several articles about that. I think I had one of them there, but I have about 5 or 6 articles about it, and it was basically that there was a rebel village in Sligo that had locked their doors against the Catholic Church. A lot of these articles appeared in American papers as well, which seemed to happen at the time, so there might have been so much in the national press over here because you were still talking about the British. We were part of the British Empire at the time, but the stories did leak out and get over to America, and I found quite a few articles in American newspapers.
Okay, so Father Flanagan could have been the person also given the speech in Glasnevin at O'Donovan Ross's grave, not Patrick Pearse. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Yes, the family, O'Donovan Ross's family, requested him to officiate at the funeral, and Tom Clark, I suppose, wasn't a huge fan of priests and the church, but in Kathleen Clark's memoirs, she said it was a toss of a coin, basically, whether Pearse or Flanagan got to make the speech at the grave. So as a compromise, Father Flanagan made the speech in City Hall an evening or two beforehand for that select group of Republicans, and Pearse got the speech at the graveyard. So Padre O'Donnell reckons that Father O'Flanagan, Jim Larkin, and who was the third one? I can't. They were the 3 best open-air speakers at the time. So he was widely known for his kind of speeches and that. So it was just really, I suppose, Clark decided to get the soldier to make the speech at the grave and to get the priest to make the speech at the laying in state.
I'll just run through all the comments as well. You did a great job, fabulous talk, thoroughly enjoyed. From Concord in America, another person from America, Christina McMullen, fascinating subject, brilliant research, I'm thoroughly enjoying. Jeremy Lally has a question. Martin, did he ever train for military activity or ever carry a gun? Superb presentation.
He did carry a gun. Michael Collins gave him a gun. He had a pistol, and the pistol is something I keep meaning to follow up, is in Collins's barracks. The family had it for years, and eventually they donated it to Collins's barracks. So actually during that speech where he was standing on the steps of Sligo Town Hall, apparently he had a gun behind his back or in his pocket. And in the box of letters there was a death threat as well. So there was a note that was saying a bullet was good enough for him. So Michael Collins gave him, he had an American pistol, and he did carry a pistol. He also did, as I said, supply the Crossnav volunteers with Hoth rifles as well.
Okay. Catherine's also a big fan of yours. Well done, Martin. Fascinating. I have a question just I'd like to draw out about it. Why could Sinn Féin not have been more tolerant to him appearing in a radio documentary about the first Dáil? I mean, he was in the first Dáil in 1919. Did he say anything controversial or?
No, what happened was Sinn Féin split again in 1926, and at that stage, they were kind of out in the wilderness. They had no chance of really getting into government. So De Valera seems to have been planning this for a while. He had gone to Rome and he had talked to Dr. Hagen, and he had got a kind of a formula for getting over the oath. Father Flanagan would be somebody who kind of stuck to his word, and Mary McSweeney as well, and they both, there was a vote, and De Valera lost the vote, and that was when he decided he was going to leave and form his own party. So there was a split, and most of the talent, they would say, in Sinn Féin left and went with De Valera to Fianna Fáil. So what was left was what Sean Lemass used to refer to as a galaxy of cranks, led by the Bishop of the Cranks, Father O'Flanagan. Now, Father O'Flanagan, from 1925 onwards, when he came back to Ireland from the States, he was called back to participate in a series of by-elections. And, he was very, very angry when he came back. He found that the church were using the sacraments as a weapon. So Republican soldiers were not being given funerals, or they weren't being allowed to, they weren't getting the sacraments in the churches, basically. And he was outraged by this. So his views on the bishops became more and more extreme. And a lot of his colleagues in Sinn Féin, like Brian O'Higgins, were ultra-Catholics, that they were really not impressed with having a vice president who was so outspoken, criticising the church. Father Flanagan would come out with things like, the Pope paid for William of Orange's army to come to Ireland. These are
very controversial things to be saying, though, in Catholic Ireland,
Absolutely. He reckoned that in Ireland we had too much religion of the knees and not enough religion of the spine.
Right. Kieran McMullen, gang from America, wonderful talk, brilliant. Finola Finlay, no questions from us, Martin, but a big thank you for a fascinating talk. Finola and Robert in West Cork. Christina McMullen, that hour went by way too fast. I could easily listen to Martin for another hour. Jonathan Gray, well done, Martin. Great slides and excellent knowledge of your subject. We'll keep an eye out for more. Sally Siggins, great talk, Martin. Thank you. Marion's brilliant talk, Martin. So you're very, very popular, I have to say. Just something that I would like to say about you is that if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't have made the documentary on Father Michael O'Flanagan. Martin, when he met me, I wasn't as familiar about the story, and Martin just kept telling me these stories, and I was like, what? He was involved in this, he was involved in that. It's a full credit to you, and I think if anyone deserves to be playing the uilleann pipes on Maud Gonne's grave as a tribute to what you did for Father Michael O'Flanagan, it's you, so fair play to you.
By the way, he was great friends with Maud Gonne, by the way, and they did a lot of work for visiting prisoners and that together back in 1921, and that the Forgotten Ten, for example, they would have visited. I did find newspaper clippings of the two of them, and they shared platforms together as well.
Before we go, do you want to mention that website again if anybody wants to find out more?
Yes, we have I put together a website. I work on websites, and I have to say I could do with a team of elves or Oompa Loompas to help me, because it's a monumental job. But www.fathermichaeloflanagan.com, there's a lot of his speeches and a lot of these photographs and letters have gone up there. The box of letters and papers, with the permission of his relatives who gave them to me, we have sent them on to the University of Limerick, and they are being published have been published on the Maynooth letters collection as well. So there's about 40 or 50 of his letters going up there. And I also run his Facebook page, and anything I find, like I regularly publish newspaper clippings and bits and pieces I find of Republican or related information there as well. So there's quite a bit of information about him online. And I would also recommend his Wikipedia page. I don't normally recommend Wikipedia, but I spent last winter rewriting it, so it was actually quite inaccurate. So he's got a fairly hefty Wikipedia presence as well. So there's a lot of information about him online. And I have to say, I'm delighted about that, because when I started looking into this, all you heard about was, if you mentioned Father Flanagan, people would start to talk about Boys Town. And he was regularly confused with Edward Flanagan, who was a priest who went to Summerhill. He was from North Roscommon and spent a lot of time in America. And that was all we ever heard, was Boys Town for the first year. And I haven't heard anybody mention Boys Town in years. So that's a sign that this is actually working and the story is getting out.
Just two more quick comments. Just Sally has said that you have a book published with Father Flanagan's letters. Some listeners might be interested. Is that true?
Well, we do. We've nearly got rid of them all, and that's the one you showed up there. I don't have a copy just to hand, but from Cliffoney to Crossna.
Oh,
and,
yeah, I have it here.
Yeah, if you could show that there.
This is the
there is a few hard copies of it left, but I am going to put it up on his website, the whole thing, because it's such a brilliant story, and that really fills in the background to the whole what happened here in Cliffoney. I mean, we had so many questions about what actually happened at that time. Nobody could agree on what happened, where they cut the turf, what happened, whatever. So to find Father Flanagan's version of it was absolutely fantastic. So we self-published that book here from Cliffoney back in 1916, 1917.
And Martin has taken me
2016, sorry.
Martin has taken me to many of the places when he made a documentary on Father Michael O'Flanagan, where they cut the turf and where they had taken over the church or locked out the church. And Brendan Holland here, he went to school with Tommy McKierney, and his mother was from Roscommon. He just thought I'd let you know. I'd like to say fascinating talk. Conquer O'Doulahan tomorrow at 8 o'clock. It's going to be fascinating, live from America. Just thanks once again, Martin, for highlighting what's a really important, often forgotten figure in Irish history, and you made him remembered again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.
No problem. All the best now, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Thank you very much, everybody.
Applause. Just unmute there and give a round of applause. I know this is weird, but this is how we do it. Well done. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marcus.
Bye now.